Now, the other day, Ray Park made a rather interesting post on Instagram, one where he showed a picture of an unpainted head prosthetic of Darth Maul's horns, along with a caption that read, "Meet me on Dathomar," which is the homeworld of Maul, and then it said Sith Life as well. He also tagged his location as being on Tatooine, and if you look closely, it almost looks like in the background, reflected in the mirror, is the arm of someone, and probably Ray Park himself, in a Darth Maul costume. And for those who may not remember very quickly, Ray Park is the original Darth Maul, the man who physically played him, though didn't voice him, back in Episode 1. He also then came back to the role for the brief appearance in Solo, and then did motion capture for Season 7 of Clone Wars. Anyway, this post has of course fueled speculation about the return of Darth Maul sometime in the not-too-distant future, with the most popular theory or belief being that it has something to do with him making a return in the upcoming Kenobi series on Disney+. Even though it wouldn't make sense for Kenobi and Maul to encounter each other during the time period the show will be set in, which is right between the prequels and original trilogy, though it could always be some sort of flashback or something along the lines of a flash forward, which I'll talk more about in a bit. However, here, recently Ewan McGregor himself confirmed, after some confusion about when and where filming would be taking place, that the Kenobi series wouldn't begin filming until late spring, and that it'd be happening in LA. And so, with that being the case, it seems a little strange that Ray Park would be getting into costume now for that, unless this was, of course, some sort of screen test or fitting, or something more along those lines. But even if that is the case, I have a hard time believing Disney and Lucasfilm would be okay with him posting this if it was for Kenobi. I don't think they'd be happy to have his return in that spoiled right away before it even begins filming. And I'm going to assume Ray Park would know that before posting it, that he'd get the okay beforehand before doing anything like this. Which then means maybe it is for something else that Lucasfilm and Disney would be okay with him spoiling Maul being in an upcoming series that could maybe even use a bit of buzz or excitement generated around it, that could use a character like Maul in it to really get fans interested, like the upcoming Andor series, which is filming right now and is set 5 years before the events of Rogue One, and thus would be set before we again see Maul in Rebels, and before he apparently gets stranded on Malachor somehow, as seen in that show. And I certainly think it makes sense, continuity-wise, that Maul could be in the upcoming Andor series, that it's not impossible the early rebellion either had dealings or run-ins or both with Crimson Dawn, the criminal faction Maul is in charge of at this time, as we learned about in Solo. Could even be we sort of see what happens to Crimson Dawn and or Maul, what sort of takes them down perhaps, and again leads to Maul eventually being seen stranded on Malachor. And who knows, maybe Cassian is even part of their organization at the start of the show. Maybe he works for Crimson Dawn and maybe directly for Darth Maul, and he eventually comes to then work for the Rebellion as a Fulcrum agent, and we do know he will become one eventually. And maybe he'll even be found by Ahsoka Tano herself, because she was the very first Fulcrum agent. And I certainly think putting Maul and Ahsoka in this series, even if it's not in huge roles, gets the show some much needed attention, and gets more people excited about it and maybe talking about it more so than they are right now. I mean, even though, like I said, it is filming right now and coming relatively soon, I'd then imagine, no one really seems to be all that excited. No one, again, is talking about it or sometimes even remembers it exists. There's also plenty of people who don't even know or remember who Cassian Andor himself is. Which is all the more reason to put some big characters like Maul and or Ahsoka in there, and then to include them in the marketing or in the trailers and such to make people really want to watch it. Which is why Ray Park was allowed to post this on Instagram, why it's not breaking any sort of NDA, because he was encouraged to sort of hint at the return of his character in order to get the wheels of speculation churning, though as far as I've seen, most seem to assume this has to do with the Kenobi series, and nothing to do with Andor. Though sure, it's certainly not impossible we'll eventually see Maul in the Kenobi series as well, though it'll be a little trickier to pull off considering it would make no sense for these two characters to meet during that time period, which again is set right between the prequels and original trilogy, or 10 years after the prequels. We even saw in Rebels, which would take place on the timeline several years after the upcoming Kenobi series, that Maul isn't even sure if Kenobi is still alive, if he survived Order 66. And then when he learns he is, he's quite delighted to say the least, and he goes and hunts him down, and eventually finds him and is, spoiler alert here, killed by Kenobi in what I think is easily one of the best episodes of that whole show, if not the very best. It showed how Kenobi had basically forgiven Maul by showing him compassion as he dies, despite all Maul had done to him, which includes, of course, killing his master Qui-Gon Jinn, and later the love of his life Satine, right in front of him in cold blood. All the while, however, Maul had never been able to let go of all his hatred and anger for Kenobi. It's what makes him sort of a tragic character, that he is so consumed by vengeance, and it's actually what always sort of ends up getting the best of him or defeating him and ultimately killing him. Furthermore, that episode of Rebels beautifully showed the difference between Sith and Jedi, and showed why Kenobi, at that point in his life, was truly ready to move on and become a Force ghost, because he'd let go of all his fear and attachments. And though the duel itself in that episode between Maul and Kenobi is very brief, to say the least, and the first time I watched it, I remember immediately thinking to myself, that's it, because there was that part of me that wanted and expected Duel of the Fates Part 2, and I missed just how perfect and awesome it actually was. Anyway, there's now this part of me that fears maybe they will somehow revisit it in Kenobi, they'll show it in flashback, or flash forward maybe I should say, and that they would make it Duel of the Fates 2.0, they wouldn't be able to help themselves but to go all in on it. And the only way doing something like that might work or might make sense is if Kenobi, in the present time of the show, is having visions of Maul coming to Tatooine and defeating him, and then finding and taking Luke and training him, and we do know Maul is always after an apprentice. And the reason why Kenobi is always seeing himself lose this fight to Maul is because some part of him also wants vengeance, that he has all this hatred for Maul, and it's pretty much what's holding him back and from moving on and maybe communing with Qui-Gon and beginning his training as a Force ghost. And so if they do it this way, if they show a flash forward of Maul versus Kenobi, where Kenobi is fueled by hatred and eventually loses, you could then sort of have your Duel of the Fates 2.0 without retconning how it actually went down in Rebels. And though, as I said, that episode of Rebels is fantastic, and I wouldn't change a thing about it, you know they at Lucasfilm are probably a little upset that they, quote-unquote, wasted that big duel, the final Maul and Kenobi confrontation, in Rebels. You know, they wish they could still go to it and do it in live action, which is why I think we will see them try to pull it off in some way, which I'm fine with as long as it does not retcon Rebels, like I said. There's also, of course, other ways to bring Maul into the Kenobi series, especially via flashback, and I absolutely think they will and should do that. I obviously think Maul is a huge part of Kenobi's story, as Kenobi is a huge part of his. In many ways, they mirror each other, so very similar, yet so very different at the same time. And I think it'd be really, really interesting if the Kenobi series digs into the relationship and love between Kenobi and Satine, and it sort of gets paralleled with Anakin and Padme's, and shows how Anakin and Obi-Wan both sort of made different choices when faced with love. You could then even have it where we see Satine's death at the hands of Maul in live action in the series, and it'll be quite shocking for those who maybe don't know the whole backstory or who have never seen Clone Wars and don't know how things are going to play out or how they're going to end for those two. And it's through this that Obi-Wan begins to finally let go of his hate, not just for Maul, who killed Satine, but for Anakin because he begins to realize why he fell to the dark side, that especially in hindsight, or having lived alone in the desert for 10 years, maybe he, Obi-Wan, would have given up or risked everything for a chance to save Satine. Anyway, there are so many amazing things they could do with the Kenobi series, just so many. It could, and should be, some of the best Star Wars we ever see. It should be the transition point for one of the best and most beloved characters in the whole franchise, and I just have this terrible fear they're going to get this wrong, that they're going to focus on all the wrong things, that they'll be so focused on surface level stuff like getting to see Vader and Kenobi fight again, or Maul and Kenobi fight again, that they will overlook all the deep and meaningful stuff that, as I said, could make this some of the best Star Wars ever. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about this Ray Park Instagram post. Was it alluding to something, or maybe just done in fun to throw us all for a loop? And where do you think Maul shows up next? Could he be in Andor? Do you think he'll be in Kenobi? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.